Today, it's my great honor to introduce Bob Quinn. Bob is a Montana cowboy with a PhD who uses his 4,000-acre spread as a learning laboratory to revive an ancient grain, to rethink agricultural practices, and to reinvigorate rural communities. He's a scientist, a farmer, an innovator, an author, and a Rotarian, importantly. We met last year when he was introducing his new book, Grain by Grain, a quest to revive ancient wheat, rural jobs, and healthy food. When I saw Bob's straw Stetson hat, I knew I'd met a new friend. We're both from a long line of Montana cowboys and cowgirls. My dad wore his Stetson every day of his life. Bob's organic Kamut brand of Corazon ancient wheat is delicious. It is pure. It is full of flavor and nutrients. He and his wife, Ann, have 5 grown children and 18 grandchildren, the 19th on the way. They live near Big Sandy, Montana, and will celebrate their 50th anniversary later this year. What means most to Bob is the early mornings in his garden, his vegetable and flower garden, and walking his 4,000 acres of test fields. When the March issue of Rotarian magazine came out, there was my new friend Bob on the cover. Thanks to Mark Davis and the program committee, we're honored to have Bob here with us today from Big Sandy, Montana. Let's give him a big, warm, muted Seattle Rotary welcome. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm just sorry I can't be there in person. It's a great honor to be invited. And wow, I thought you've already had a great program already. I feel very humbled to be included in such a day as today and to follow some of the wonderful and very thought-provoking things that have been said. My story is quite a bit different. We are on the prairie of north central Montana. I thought maybe it'd be fun. I'll give you a little tour. I'm sitting up in my office right now, but I'll take you outside real quick so you can see that we really are on the prairie. Hope the sun isn't too bad against it, but there's the Bear Paw Mountains in the background. If you can see, we can have a few fields that are just starting to come up. There's my garden in the background, the other side of my lawn, and you probably can't see my orchards on the other side. But anyway, I've downsized my operation in the last 2 years by renting out most of my farm to a couple of my farm hands that worked for me for 6 years. I farmed for 40 years. I figured that was enough. I've had my turn, and I thought it'd be great for the next generation to have their turn. None of my 5 kids showed up back on the farm to take it over. So now it's being farmed by the next generation, even though it's not my direct descendants, and they're having a great time and keeping it organic, and they're having their turn. And I am thrilled about that. So I've downsized from 4,000 to 4 acres. And on that 4 acres, I have a small orchard, all experimental. I have dryland vegetables that I'm trying to grow, showing that we can grow a certain amount of food without irrigation. We have an average of 13 inches of rainfall here in this part of Montana, and it's surprising what you can grow if you just space the plants a little further apart and keep the weeds away. And I'm really enjoying that. To give you a little background, I was raised here. This farm now will turn 100 years old next week, actually, 12th of June. My grandmother and grandfather were married and started right next to my grandma's folks' place. So we will celebrate 100 years next week of the founding of Quinn Farm and Ranch, our farm here. And this is where my dad grew up. This is where I grew up. And it's where I raised, my wife and I raised our children. So it's been the main home I've known, except for the 10 years I was away at college. I went to college to study 2 loves of my life. One is plants. So I studied botany, and the other is science. So I went on from a BS in botany at Montana State University to a master's degree there in plant pathology, and then on to UC Davis in California to study plant biochemistry. I thought I envisioned myself as a great plant scientist someday, and I was a little disillusioned with academia by the time I had spent 10 years there, and I was surprised at how much focus there was on trying to renew grants and just money, and trying to have enough money to run scientific programs. We were told in our lab not to even speak to some of the other competing labs that were working on similar projects, because they were in competition with us for the next grant. And I was very surprised about that. I was a little naive about how things worked, and was interested in pushing back the frontiers of knowledge in science, no matter where they were found, and who you could cooperate with in doing it. So anyway, I ended up coming back to our farm in 1978. And for 40 years, I farmed here, and it wasn't very long that my whole farm became my laboratory and my garden. But we found that it was a little bit small, even though it was 2,400 acres at that time, to support two families. My folks were still here, and now two families, and it supported one family very comfortably with wheat and cattle that we had a diversified operation, 1,200 acres of pasture, 1,200 acres of cropland, 50 cow-calf pairs of beef cattle, old Herefords is what we ran. And yet it wasn't really enough to support two families comfortably. And so I tried to shift around, or look around, I should say, for some ways to augment our income. I didn't really want to go to town and get a job. I didn't come home to work in town. I came home to farm, and my wife we had three kids, and the fourth one coming pretty quick. So she was already more than full time. And besides, she was a good help to me on the farm, and I didn't want to send her to town either to get an extra job. And she would help drive truck and during harvest, and swathing machine during haying. And so we were a team, and I didn't want to break that up. But I ran across a cousin of mine in California who was unemployed and didn't have anything to do. And I said to him, Steve, I said, why don't you see if you can sell some of my wheat down in Southern California to the whole grain bakers down there? And lo and behold, in about 10 days, he had a customer that started taking a truckload of wheat, and they were paying $1 a bushel premium. And this is at a time when our wheat sold for about $3. So it was a huge premium, and really made a difference in our income, and started to turn things around. We, within a year, the fellow that we were selling to, he was very happy with the quality. The protein was high. The quality of bread he was making was wonderful. And he started asking me for organic grain. And I said to him, well, I don't know anything about that, but I'll be glad to look around. I didn't tell him how I felt about organic. I thought it was a bunch of hooey. I had been trained in university that a plant couldn't tell the difference between nitrogen coming from a pile of manure and one out of a bag of nitrogen of ammonium sulfate. And so what was the difference? And so I never really took it very seriously. But when I finally found an organic farmer in Northeast Montana and started buying grain from him, and then the guy wanted more organic grain, so I had to find some more. And this is about 84. There weren't very many organic farmers around then. And when I started meeting them, they invited me to one of their meetings, and I was surprised at what I heard there. Mostly they were young folks, my age, just in their early 30s, late 20s. And they were all excited about their farm and what was going on with their soils. And it was much different than the Farm Bureau meetings and the grain grower meetings I was used to going to, where everybody was just complaining about the price of grain, which is usually something to complain about anyway, but complaining about the government programs, and the focus was how we can get more money from the government, and the commodity programs and all this stuff. And it was really gloom and doom. None of my friends' parents were encouraging them to come back to the farm. They said, you go to town and you get educated, you get a good job, and don't you come back to, there's no history, there's no future. There's no future here in agriculture. And that was the attitude. And I thought, oh, this is kind of a sad state. But these guys, they talked about how their soils had started to change, and how their the tilth in their ground when they turned organic would lighten up so they could feel it under their feet when they walked across it. They talked about growing their own fertilizer by planting legumes, sweet clovers and alfalfas and things like that, instead of buying nitrogen. They talked about rotations that broke up disease cycles and weed cycles and pest cycles. So they didn't need to use pesticides and other chemicals. I was very intrigued about this, and the kind of scientist in me started to boil up, and I said, wow, I've got to try this for myself. And in 86, I tried my first experiment on 20 acres. My father was quite skeptical, but I mean, 20 acres was less than 1% of our farm. It wasn't a big risk. And at the end of the experiment, the crop was identical to the chemical crop right bordering it. The yields were the same, the quality was the same, and my experiment was on a plow down of alfalfa. It had been in alfalfa for 3 years, and that had enriched the soil and given it the nutrition it needed, and it grew a crop every bit as good as my father's chemical crop. And he had spent tens of thousands of dollars a year on chemicals and trying to farm in this industrial model, and yet here this whippersnapper just home from California had created or harvested the same kind of crop that he had been harvesting with all of its expensive inputs, and I had no inputs except for the plowing down the alfalfa. And the next year we had the opportunity to, well, I was excited. I was really excited. So I said, Dad, I said, well, this is fantastic. I said, why don't we plant 25% next year to organic? He said, ooh, he said, how about 10? And I said, well, how about 15? He said, okay, 15. So we started increasing our conversion to organic. And the next year, it was 88, because the harvest had been in 87. We planted winter wheat in 86 and harvested in 87. In 88, we had a drought. And so in Montana, when we have drought, we normally have grasshoppers, and that was no exception. And the grasshoppers were coming in by hordes. And of course, the chemical prescription for that was malathion. And we just called the spray plane, and it came along and sprayed your field, and the grasshoppers were all dead. And the pilots would say, now be careful, don't go in that field for 24 hours. You know, it's poison after all. I thought, I know. But I called up my organic friends and I said, what do you do about grasshoppers? Because I had some fields at that point which were organic. And they said, oh, don't worry, just put on Nosema was it called, and it was a protozoa, a little smaller than a bacteria, and you put it on wheat bran, you spread it around the edge of your field. The grasshoppers, as they moved in, and they were moving in from the grass into the wheat, and before they got there, you had to put that around the field, and they would eat that wheat bran, and then they got sick. And then they ate their friends. They were sick. And so the disease spread throughout the whole bunch of grasshoppers. And even though they cleaned off about 20, maybe 15, 20 feet of a crop around the edges, by the time I went in for harvest, there was no grasshoppers in that field. They were just gone. And meanwhile, the malathion field, about 10 days after we first sprayed, another flock of grasshoppers came in, started eating and chewing away. And I couldn't afford to spray twice, so we let it go. And by harvest time, we had a very poor crop. Anyway, it was a drought year after all. But there were more grasshoppers in the combine tank than there was wheat. And I told my dad, I said, I am done. I am done with chemical agriculture. I'm not going to be buying any more pesticides or chemicals or nothing. And he was supportive. And so we're on our way. That was the last time we used chemicals in 1988 on our farm. And within about 3 or 4 years, we will have been organic as long as we had been chemical and using chemical compounded fertilizers and pesticides. So I'm really excited for that anniversary that's coming up. And then the other thing that occurred along the way, we started going to food shows, and my parents came along with me to the first one. My dad brought with him a jar of this ancient wheat that I had first seen in the county fair when I was probably a sophomore in high school. And this wheat was supposed to have come out of a tomb, we were told. That turned out not to be true. I went to Egypt myself, and I looked in the museum, and what the grain that they took out of the tombs was einkorn. It wasn't what I had, which is much larger and easy to detect and to see just the appearance is so different. But anyway, I had it was a giant wheat, and I had seen this in high school. And when I was in Davis, just finishing my doctorate, I was eating a package of corn nuts one day, and on the back of the package it says, corn nuts made with a giant wheat. And I called up the corn nuts people, and I said, would you be interested in or made a giant corn, they said. And I said, would you be interested in a giant wheat like your giant corn to make a snack? And they said, oh yeah, we might be interested. So I called my dad, and I said, Dad, see if you can find some of that old King Tut's wheat. And within a week, he found a little jar about, a pint jar about 3/4 full. And he sent me a couple tablespoons, and I sent that to corn nuts. And they called back in a few 10 days or so, and they said, wow, this stuff is fantastic. We'll take 10,000 pounds. And I said, oh, well, I don't really have 10,000 pounds. I didn't tell them I didn't have 10,000 pounds. I didn't tell them I only had a pint. I said, you know what? I don't quite have that much now, but if you'll give me a year or two, I'll have everything you want. And so I called my dad. I said, Dad, plant all of that in the garden right now. And so luckily it was spring. And so he did that, hand thrashed it out. And we would send then the harvest to California and plant it during the winter. So we were getting 2 crops a year until we had about 50 pounds. And then I called up the corn nuts people. This is 2 or 3 years later. And the guy I talked to was gone. No one even remembered the project. No one was interested in a new project. And they just told me that, you know, they just were sorry, but they didn't care anything about it. So I put it on the shelf, and there it sat for, 4 or 5, 6 years until we went to our first food show in California. And my dad showed this to everybody that went by our booth. He showed it to hundreds of people. And meanwhile, my cousin and I were trying to sell our stone ground flour and our organic wheat from Montana. And Dad was trying to peddle this jar of ancient grain. And after 3 days, one person stopped by and said, oh, wow, he said, that's just what I'm looking for. He said, if you grow that, I'll buy everything you can produce. And so we went home, we planted 50 pounds and a half an acre, and that was in '86, and that was our first beginning of our correspondent project. And last year, about 3 years ago, I guess, we were at the peaked off, and we had 100,000 acres under cultivation in Montana, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, which were spread over about 250 organic farms in that region. So it was really phenomenal growth. Most of the products are found in Italy. 3/4 of what we grow goes to Italy. They make over 2,500 different products there. You can find some in America, less than 100, I'm sorry to say, in North America. But you can find in health food stores. And what really spurred it was we gave some samples of this grain to a friend who couldn't eat wheat. At least my dad did. And I said, Dad, what'd you give that to her for? She knows wheat makes her sick. And he says, well, it's organic, isn't it? And I said, oh my gosh, he's more converted than I am. And so he was quite a promoter. And the gal called back the next day and she says, what is this stuff? She said, it makes me feel better when I eat it. And he said, wow, well, we'll give you some more. And so she said, you know, my sister can't eat wheat either. He said, well, I can give her some. And it was a pasta that we had made from it. It was very, very delicious. And we gave it to enough for her sister. And her sister, in a few weeks, called back. She says, you know, not only could I eat it, but I have sensitivities to lots of foods. And within about 2 or 3 weeks, I was less sensitive to other foods too. And I said, wow, this is something really special. This is like a gift from the Lord. This is not just a novelty anymore. And so we changed our whole approach to it. And we decided to register a trademark, which we registered as Kamut, which is an Egyptian name for wheat, because at that time we still thought it was from Egypt. And then we made the rules up for the use of the trademark. Trademark doesn't mean we own the grain, but it means that we use it in marketing and make guarantees to our customers. And the guarantees we make that this grain is 100% ancient grain, never been changed or adulterated in any way. It's always 100% organically grown. So those are our promises for the trademark. And we started then doing research, and I had a hard time finding people in America who wanted to help me do research. Never in those days, people didn't believe that wheat sensitivities were real. Most of the professors thought it was something in your head. It was an illusion that people were having. But in Italy, we found a different attitude, and we found a group in the University of Bologna and the University of Florence, a medical hospital, very large, and we're now a medical teaching hospital there, a research hospital. And we started doing research, and we found that the most important thing we found of the grain, comparing it to modern wheat, it's anti-inflammatory. Modern wheat causes inflammation at low levels, and this is anti-inflammatory. And because inflammation is tied to all chronic disease, we started then to study chronic disease like heart disease, irritable bowel syndrome, diabetes, fibromyalgia, those kinds of things. And all the results were the same, even though the tests weren't very large, but they were double-blind tests of people ate one diet or another diet for 3 or 4 weeks, and then they had a similar washout period, and then they eat the other diet. And what we found was that not only the inflammation was the biggest thing. It was 30 to 40% difference. It was huge. But also the people on the diet of ancient grain had elevated zinc and magnesium in their blood. They had decreased cholesterol. The diabetics had lower blood sugar. They had lower insulin resistance was down. So it was quite an amazing difference. That opened up a whole new world to me of appreciation of the importance of link between food and health. That right now we both just complain about the high price of food. We should complain about the high price of health. And the reason we have a high price of health because we're not eating right and we're not eating healthy food. And so that's been our pretty much our goal and what we've been able to do. And I've worked on that project for over 30 years now. So it's been great fun. Now I'm working with, I knew I would have a limited time, so I'd already mentioned, but you can get the whole story in my book, Grain by Grain, if you want to see how everything ends or really the details. What I'm having most fun right now, I'm working with nearby Rocky Boy Reservation where diabetes runs rampant. And we have helped them convert 500 acres to organic. They're growing kamut on it. We've got a flour mill set up so that they can grind their own flour. I'm working now with potatoes. This is a Huckleberry Gold potato. It's purple on the outside. If you cut it open, it's yellow on the inside. It's a very delicious potato, but it's high in resistant starch. And that's also good for diabetics. So I'm trying to work with people with food which have really particular characteristics can help their health. And so we have about an acre of potatoes planted up in the reservation this year. And those are the kinds of things we're doing that's really means a lot to me. And it's not only fun, but it's very satisfying. And so I don't know how we're doing on time. We're probably running out.
We are at time, actually. Good job
Okay.
on spotting that. I believe we have time for one or two questions,
Okay.
if you would like to switch over to those. All right, so reading questions out of our chat here for you. The first one is from Rod Walbaum, and he's wondering about the economics of organics and if organic growers save money by not buying pesticides, why are organic products more expensive?
Well, it's not a question of organic products being more expensive. It's a question of the non-organic being too cheap. The food that we buy now is so cheap that farmers aren't paid enough to even make a decent living, and are going broke all over. Half of the farms have disappeared in my neighborhood. That affects small towns. Our community has gone from 1,000 to 600 in just the last 30 years. This is the result of cheap food, one of the things, and the health problems of eating cheap food are just astronomical. We grow our own fertilizers that I mentioned. We don't use pesticides because of rotation, so it does save a lot on inputs, and we're able to sell what we raise for nice premiums that make a decent living for farmers, which, so because we're growing it for less money and selling it for more, we're able to be very successful financially. And it's very exciting about that. I look for the time that there'll be more growers. Right now, it's 6% of all the food in America is organic. And if you want to support that system and help more growers convert, then buy organic, because that's where the future is. It's the future of agriculture, and it's the future of health in our country.
All right, thank you very much. We've got time for one more question from Eric Christensen. He's wondering if the nation's land-grant universities have done a disservice to small farmers by emphasizing high yield and chemical-dependent agriculture.
Well, it's not only the universities, the whole country, the government, the whole government and the national goal has been high yields and cheap food, and they've accomplished that. And it has been a disservice. But on the flip side of that, we have had help from our land-grant universities. I mean, in the beginning, people that helped me were fired. Some of them were fired here in Montana because they were claimed to be doing work that was of no value. That time has passed, and now there is a scattering of people working on organic research in almost every land-grant university in the country. They're in the minority, that's for sure. They're fighting against dogma, that's for sure. They're not, they're not well positioned normally, but they're there, and that's a beginning. And we really appreciate that. And and I'm really thankful for that change that we're starting to see.
All right, we have time for one more question after all. So I'll take this last one from Kathy, and she's wondering if you know where your grain came from if it wasn't from Egypt.
Ah, that's a good question. So when I was in Turkey doing some experiments there, so I've been all over the world trying to see where this grain can grow best. And we came back to the upper Great Plains of North America is where it really grows best. But in Turkey, they said to me, oh, well, we know this wheat. We call it camel's tooth. And I found that throughout the Middle East that we referred to camel's tooth. Or they said, we also call it the prophet's wheat. And I said, whoa, well, that's really interesting. I said, why do you call it the prophet's wheat? I said, to have something to do with Muhammad, because, you know, Turkey is pretty Muslim. I didn't want to get on the wrong side of any of those discussions. And they said to me, oh, no, not that prophet. They said, you know, the one with the boat. I said, the boat? I said, you mean Noah? They said, oh, yes, this is the grain that Noah brought with him on the ark. And I said, wow, so that's a lot better story than my old tomb story. But so those are the legends. Scientists say it came from Mesopotamia, which is, of course, Turkey's part of that. And these kind of grains did not originate in Egypt. So it was certainly brought there much later by invading armies from the Romans or the Greeks or somebody. But those are the legends that we've run into, so you can pick your favorite one, I guess.
Thank you, Bob, for such a great story and for joining us today and for letting us see Montana. How great is
good. Well, I hope I can join you in person once this is over and we get meeting again. I've got a daughter north of Seattle, so I do get in your neighborhood once in a while.
Yes, please come visit us in person.
I will do that. Thank you.
Yes, you are so welcome. Thank you. And thank you to Geraldine, Mark Davis, and the program committee for bringing Bob to Rotary.